When Gavin appeared in the living room of the old house with her 2-year-old genius son, I awake into the plot of a vicious female supporting role. It turns out that Gavin is the female lead in an old-fashioned and melodramatic CEO novel. And the male lead is precisely my husband, Holden, as this vicious female supporting role. After Gavin returned to the country with a child, I targeted and framed her everywhere and was loathed by Holden. In order to make up for Gavin and enemies, he ruined my family and personally locked me up in a mental hospital. On the day I was admitted to the mental hospital, it was pouring rain outside. Holden's eyebrows and eyes were full of disgust and indifference. Savior, spend the rest of your life making amends here. I was startled into a cold sweat by the sudden plot in my mind. In order to avoid the final tragic ending, I decided to divorce Holden. But Holden was unusually different. He tore up the divorce agreement into pieces. His eyes were red at the corners. And he hugged me and said through gritted teeth, "Wanting a divorce? Unless I die. Holden, now you have a wife and family. And you are happy and fulfilled. Why do you still have to compete with me for Philip?" Gavin's beautiful eyes were filled with tears. Holding her son with her left hand, she stared firmly at Holden in front of her. The light black and messy hair swayed disobediently on the side of her face, making her look even more elegant and delicate. Philip blinked his eyes that were exactly like Holden's and explained in a childish voice while looking at Gavin, "Mommy, don't blame Daddy. I found it myself after seeing the photo in your pocket watch." I hid in a dark corner on the second floor and stared blankly at the confrontation downstairs. The plot in my mind was still playing back continuously. It turns out that the world I am in is an old-fashioned and melodramatic CEO novel. And Gavin is the sweet and beloved female lead in it. The male lead is precisely my husband, Holden. 2 years ago, Holden was drugged by his rival. Just then, he met Gavin, who delivered the wrong takeout. In order to relieve his desire, Holden pulled over the innocent Gavin. After a night of passion, Gavin was pregnant. In panic, she ran abroad with the child for 2 years. After returning, her genius son was curious about who his father was. So he took the photo in Gavin's cherished pocket watch and found our Fu family's old house all the way. And as this vicious female supporting role, after I found that Holden, who had always been distant and indifferent, became more and more concerned about Gavin, I was consumed by jealousy and deliberately framed Evemin. Even the baby in my womb that hadn't formed yet was used by me as a tool to frame Gavin. Under my actions, Holden loathed me deeply. In the end, my parents went bankrupt and were left homeless. I myself was also sent to a mental hospital. My mother, who had never suffered in her life, turned white overnight and lost her mind after I was locked up in the mental hospital. She was everywhere looking for news about me. My father, who had a soft heart despite his tough words, took out all his savings after going bankrupt and begged Holden to see me. But on the way there, he had a sudden heart attack. I didn't even get to see him for the last time. On the day I was admitted to the hospital, it was pouring rain, and the black clouds were gloomy. At that time, this love-struck person, still held onto the hospital railing tightly and asked Holden earfully word by word if he had ever loved me even a little bit. Holden's eyebrows and eyes were full of disgust and indifference. Looking at me was like looking at garbage on the street. "Savior, the thing I regret the most is marrying you and giving you the chance to hurt Zhao Li. Spend the rest of your life making amends here." The loathing tones still lingered in my ears. For so many years, for the first time, I questioned whether my love for him was ridiculously wrong from the very beginning. Holden and I were childhood sweethearts and from families of equal status. Even if it was a business marriage, I always firmly believed that Holden had feelings for me. After all, besides me, there was no other woman by his side. Moreover, there were so many possible marriage partners. If he had no feelings for me, why would he marry me? Even though he was indifferent and distant to me, I always comforted myself thinking that it was just his cold nature. Once when he came back from a social event drunk and hugged me, His distinct knuckles lovingly stroked the corner of my eye. He was drunk and his eyes were hazy. He chuckled and murmured in an indulgent tone, "You are really beautiful without wearing that old-fashioned black-rimmed glasses." At that time, I just thought he was talking nonsense because he was drunk. It wasn't until Gavin's appearance today, wearing that distinctive black-rimmed glasses. Only then did I suddenly realize how ridiculously pathetic and despicable I was being a love-struck person. To confirm the accuracy of the plot, I asked my special assistant to investigate the background of the female lead. Gavin's background was the same as in the plot. It was very in line with the setting of a romance novel. Female lead: an abusive father, a weak mother, a gambling brother, and an inspiring her. My fingertips holding the photo turned pale. The soreness and anger in my heart were suddenly covered by a huge panic. If everything is true, what should I do? In the next month, I deliberately avoided Holden. Although I liked Holden, that thin bit of liking wasn't enough for me to lose my parents' business and myself. I am beautiful and rich. With a wave of my hand, men can line up like a football team. Why should I struggle with two crazy people? After making up my mind, my special assistant helped me contact Bryson, a famous lawyer in the capital. When I saw Bryson, surprise flashed in my eyes. Unlike the stereotypical image of a lawyer in a rigid uniform, Bryson in front of me was more like a carefree playboy, with a smile on his lips. But his eyebrows and eyes were extremely cold. It seemed that nothing in the world could affect his emotions. He was so handsome and roguelike that he could debut immediately. I put away the doubts in my eyes and invited Bryson to a restaurant to discuss the details of the divorce. Compared to his unreliable appearance, his professional ability was extremely strong. The two of us had a great conversation. But at this time, Holden, who had never cared much about me, surprisingly sent me a text message asking where I was. I glanced at the chat box, didn't reply, and turned off the screen and put it aside. Bryson, seeing my action, raised his eyebrows playfully. He said, "Holden is not an ordinary person. Savior, I need more money." I was amused by his honesty and gently clinked glasses with him. "You won't be short-changed." After discussing everything properly, Bryson sent me back to my own apartment. The living room was dark with no lights on. I groped to turn on the light. At the moment the light came on, I was startled by the figure on the sofa. Holden had a scruffy beard and cold and lonely eyebrows and eyes. It seemed that he hadn't slept well for many days. He had a cigarette burning between his fingertips and sat silently on the sofa. The ashtray was full of cigarette butts, and there were dozens of photos scattered on the table. I walked over and picked them up to look through. They were all of me and Bryson. The angles at which the photos were taken made them seem extremely ambiguous. I remained silent. Holden slowly raised his bloodshot eyes. His voice was deep and hoarse. "Who is he? Haven't come home for so long. Are you with him?" Thinking of Gavin and her son, I couldn't help but sneer. Before I could even ask him, he dared to suspect me first? I gritted my back teeth. The veins on my forehead bulged with anger. The malice in my heart gradually rose. I coldly curled the corner of my mouth and replied nonchalantly and even a bit inferently, "Of course. It's the same identity as your Gavin. What else could it be?" Holden was stunned for a few seconds, and then regained his composure. He exhaled a puff of smoke and pressed the cigarette into the ashtray. "I made you wronged in this matter. Ask for any compensation you want. But Philip is my own son. He must return to the Fu family's house." Calm, indifferent, without a trace of emotion. This was Holden's usual tone. He didn't consider what an embarrassing situation I, the original wife, would be in the circle after his illegitimate child came back. Nor did he consider my feelings. Instead, he directly informed me of his decision. I was so angry by the taken-for-granted tone in his words that I felt cold all over. I sneered and replied, "Don't let Gavin come back together? Holden, I really feel so meaningless after all these years. Let's divorce. I'll give way to her." Holden paused when he heard this. He looked up and stared at me firmly. I looked back coldly. The intertwined gazes met in the air. Like soldiers from two countries at war. No one was willing to back down first. Savior. My patience is limited. Think before you speak. I've thought about it many times. Holden. I want a divorce from you. I'll give you the divorce agreement in a few days. Holden's eyebrows were cold and stern. As I expected. He didn't show any reaction to my words. He only replied coldly. Fine. I hope you've really considered it this time and not be like when you were a child and stick to me like a dogskin plaster again. After saying that, he got up infuriately and left my house without any hesitation. Harsh words and a loathing tone. If I had been treated so coldly and harshly by him before, my heart would have already been in pain as if it had been rolled through a pot of hot oil. But this time, my heart was unexpectedly calm. I don't know if it was because I had heard too much and was immune to it, or if I was so disappointed and numb to our relationship that it reached the extreme. I wondered if I really liked him as much as I thought I did. The awakening of the plot was like a string of destruction codes, making me, this NPC who had been set by the program, suddenly break free. My once deep and unforgettable love for Holden also seemed like water draining from a lotus leaf. It didn't leave a single trace in my heart. The next day, an unexpected guest asked me to meet at a coffee shop. When I arrived, Gavain was feeding her son snacks. I casually put my limited edition Hermes on the seat, and didn't even take off my sunglasses. Looking at Gavain, I said, "What's the matter? Speak quickly if you have something to say." Seeing my bag, Philip beside her had a tightly pursed little face, full of vigilance. His eyes stared at me full of hostility. I frowned impatiently. After a long silence, Gavin finally raised her eyes softly and said sincerely, "Savior, inviting you out this time is not because I want to enter the Fu family, nor is it to show off and provoke you with Philip. Instead, I want to ask for your help." I crossed my arms and had an expressionless face, waiting for her next words. Holden's mother found out about Philip's existence 2 days ago. She secretly took Philip from the kindergarten to do a paternity test. Now she is threatening and bribing me. She must make Philip return to the Fu family. At this point, Galvin's eyes filled with tears again. She bit her lip enduringly. That night 2 years ago was just an accident. I don't need Holden to be responsible for me. I only have Philip as a son. No one can take him away from me. But I am really alone and weak. Now the only one who can help me is you. Savior. You must also not want Philip to enter the house. Right? I leaned back on the chair and looked coldly at Gavin in front of me, who was wiping away ears. Listen. 1 Holden. 2 Holden. The intimacy in her tone. If one didn't know, one would think that she, Gavin, was the original wife. She thought that I, the original wife, definitely wouldn't want an illegitimate child to enter the house. But I was about to divorce Holden. Whomever Philip was raised by had nothing to do with me. Trying to drag me into the water was just a dream. But looking at Gavin in front of me, who was constantly crying and acting like a little white flower, I was really annoyed. I didn't believe that she was really as innocent as she seemed on the surface. I didn't know how she, a delivery person back then, could be so capable and quietly run abroad. If she really didn't want to, there must be a way for her to escape with Philip, right? I lazily brushed aside my slightly curly long hair, intending to disgust her. I opened my mouth like a real vicious female supporting role. If Philip returns to the Fu family, I will be his biological mother. If I help you and it is found out by the Fu family, not only will I be loathed by my husband and mother-in-law, but I won't get any benefits. So why should I help you? Gavin's movement of wiping tears stopped. Obviously, she didn't expect me to say that. Philip beside her couldn't hold back anymore. He pulled Gavin's sleeve and shouted, "Stupid mommy. I told you not to look for this bad woman who broke up you and Daddy. Grandma likes me very much. When I go back to Grandma's house, I will ask Dad to divorce this bad woman. Kick her out. And then bring you back. Mm. Gavin quickly covered Philip's mouth, forced a smile at the corners of his mouth, and awkwardly smiled at me. Sorry. Savior. Children say whatever comes to mind. Children say whatever comes to mind? I raised an eyebrow in amusement. At only 2 years old. He has so many malicious intentions. I don't know if it's the setting of a genius baby in a melodramatic novel or taught by adults. Logically, I shouldn't care about a child. But I am a vicious female supporting role. How can I live up to my character design if I don't care? I still had the same expression. A smile on my lips. I spoke softly and done hurriedly to Philip. Good son. Mom is waiting for you at home with a broom. Hearing this, Philip's face flushed with anger. He glared at me viciously. It felt great. After arguing with that bad child and Davwine, I left the coffee shop in a great mood. As soon as I got in the car, a thought flashed through my mind like lightning. Now the plot is at the time when Philip is 2 years old, and is being fought over by Holden's mother to come home. In the plot. At this time point, I seemed to be pregnant too. Thinking of this, I became more and more uneasy. I rushed all the way to the hospital. After a series of examinations. As expected. Although I had expected it all the way. Looking at the test result in my hand showing that I was 2 months pregnant, I still fell into confusion. Since I want to cut off cleanly with Holden, now is undoubtedly the best time to abort the child. I looked at the child who was not yet formed and hadn't even seen the world. I slowly placed my palm on my lower abdomen. In the ultrasound, his little hand waved gently as if greeting me. At that moment, my determination to abort wavered. The maternal love that surged from the bottom of my heart made my heart soft. It seemed as if it could no longer beat. Do I want to deprive him of the right to even see this world? Do I want him to appear every time only to pay for my mistakes? I stood silently in the hospital corridor, not knowing what to do. Bryson asked me to check if there were any omissions in the divorce agreement. After I finished my company's affairs, I asked my special assistant to reserve a riverside restaurant with a beautiful view. As night fell, the evening breeze was gentle. Bryson pushed the printed divorce agreement in front of me. I carefully read it over, and made sure there were no problems with interests and details. The gentle breeze gently blew my slightly curly long hair. Bryson's eyes unconsciously looked at me as I was reading carefully. I raised my eyes and met his gaze looking at me. Bryson casually looked away, and looked at the noisy crowd downstairs. After looking for a while, a glint of interest flashed in his eyes. He looked at me and joked. Savior. It seems that we are very fated with that little white flower. Following his gaze, I looked downstairs. Gavin was in a panic and apologizing to the bald man in front of her who was splashed with soup all over. The man angrily took off his Rolex on his wrist and shook it. Then his triangular eyes glared angrily. The flesh on his face was full of fierceness. He tightly held Gavin's wrist and shouted angrily at her. I sat upstairs, propped my chin with one hand, and narrowed my eyes to watch the show. Just when Gavin was in tears and helplessly surrounded by the crowd, Holden and his group appeared like gods descending. Holden's eyes were as cold as frost. He walked slowly. The aura of a superior with a natural sense of oppression made the onlookers unconsciously make way for his group. The bald man was also intimidated by his aura and subconsciously let go of Gavin's hand. Holden looked at the bald man expressionlessly, gently pulled Gavin over and protected her. Gavin's soft and tender white palm tightly held Holden's arm. Her helpless expression also gradually calmed down like a baby bird finally finding its mother. Holden took out a check, wrote a number on it and threw it to the bald man. Then he calmly held Gavin and walked out of the crowd. To be honest, I was almost sweetened by Holden and Gavin. If he wasn't my husband. This guy carries a check and a pen with him when he goes out? Bryson's abrupt voice rang out. His understated tone mixed with doubt instantly destroyed the pink bubbles around. I couldn't help but chuckle when I looked at Bryson. My laughable sense of humor made me almost laugh out tears. My shoulders couldn't stop shaking. I apologized. Bryson waved his hand indifferently. His cool gaze swayed in the river breeze and fell on my smiling face. The corners of his mouth also unconsciously curled up. My special assistant picked me up. After waving goodbye to Bryson, I got in the car. But when the car was halfway there, I watched in horror as a large truck, coming in the opposite direction, crashed head-on. I was dizzy. Subconsciously, I tightly protected my stomach. The surrounding sounds were noisy. There seemed to be the sound of an ambulance. My eyes slowly closed and darkness descended. When I opened my eyes again, I was already lying in the hospital. My parents were traveling abroad. After hearing about my car accident, they immediately booked a flight to come back. At this time, the person accompanying me was Aunt Wang, the housekeeper on my parents' side. As soon as she saw me wake up, she immediately got up and called the nurse. Holding my hand tightly, she chanted thankfully, "Thank God. Blessings from the Bodhisattva. The child is fine. Miss. Don't worry." I let out a heavy breath and endured the pain and lay back on the hospital bed. At this moment, Holden pushed the door open and walked in with a cold expression. He still had the smell of wind and rain from outside. It seemed that he had just rushed over from outside. Aunt Wang glared at Holden unhappily. "Sir, you really come at a great time. My young lady has been in a coma for 3 days and you haven't come. Now that she wakes up, you just arrive." Holden's cold expression became even more intense. He ignored Aunt Wang and didn't take another step closer to me. Instead, he stood at the door and looked at me coldly. "Did you regret the divorce you agreed on? This time you even used a car accident as a bitter trick. Savior, you really have a lot of tricks." Lying on the hospital bed, I silently looked at this man whom I had loved for many years. After a long while, a laugh came out from my chest. But this laugh also made my internal organs feel as if they had shifted positions. Holden still looked at me coldly. Bryson appeared behind Holden holding a thermos. His tone was as cold as February ice. Full of coldness. "President Fu, please move aside." Holden's gaze swept over Bryson for a moment. His already indifferent eyes were now filled with sarcasm. "The special assistant said you had a car accident after having a meal with Bryson. Last time you also met alone. No matter what relationship it is. Mrs. Fu, I don't want any negative news about you during our marriage. For the sake of our family's stocks, I hope you can cut off cleanly." For the first time in his life, Holden said so many words to me in one breath. But it was still to warn me. I looked at Holden and said coldly, "When Gavin showed up at the old house with her illegitimate child, why didn't you consider the stocks?" "Holden, don't overestimate yourself. I am not your easy-to-manipulate little white flower Gavin. It's my freedom to associate with whoever I want. After I leave the hospital, we will go for a divorce. Now, please get out." Holden looked down on me coldly. I saw him clenching his back molars in anger. Then he took 2 steps back, turned around, and left the ward. I lay irritably on the bed. Bryson opened the thermos. It was millet porridge made by him at home. Aunt Wang smiled affectionately and whispered in my ear, "Bryson has been here to accompany you for 3 days. I think he is a good boy." I frowned slightly, a bit puzzled. Why did he come to accompany me? After Aunt Wang went out, I looked at Bryson's back as he busied himself pouring porridge and water for me. After hesitating for a moment, I said, "My car accident has nothing to do with you. You should be busy with your law firm. Don't worry about me." He was unmoved by my words. After a long while, he said softly, "Sister Yeezy. Sister Yeezy?" Bryson's handsome and charming face gradually overlapped with the chubby kid from Grandpa Jiang's house when I was a child. I covered my mouth and exclaimed in surprise, "Could it be that you are Nathaniel?" Bryson raised an eyebrow slightly and smiled and tilted his head, confirming it. After my parents divorced, they changed their names. Jin is my mother's surname. Bryson. Nathaniel. My childhood playmate. He has always loved clinging to me and called me Sister Yeezy. When I was 10 years old, his parents divorced. Aunt Jin was going to take him to the UK. The day before leaving, he hugged me and cried all night, making my lace-white gauze princess dress all wrinkled. Sometimes he said he didn't want to leave, and sometimes he asked me to wait for him to come back. But no matter how reluctant he was still pulled onto the plane by Aunt Jin. Since then, we lost contact. I didn't expect to meet again in such a situation. I gently punched him and asked reproachfully with a smile. You didn't tell me when you came back and tricked me for so long. Bryson tucked in the quilt for me. His tone was flippant and seemed a bit melancholy. After returning to China, I found out that you were married. I wasn't mentally prepared to meet your nominal husband yet, so I didn't look for you. I was stuck by his words. Bryson suddenly put away his playful expression and said seriously to me, perhaps you should check that special assistant by your side. This car accident is not so simple. What Bryson said was exactly what I was thinking. The information he gave me about Gavin and the photos of me and Bryson in Holden's hands. Plus, this car accident could have been avoided. All these signs made me have to suspect my special assistant Elias. There is no such character in the plot, so I don't know what his purpose is. I secretly sent someone to check Gavin's information and Elias's network again. Elias and Gavin were once waiters in a restaurant. Elias had a withdrawn personality. Only the kind-hearted Gavin was willing to talk to him. Since then, a ray of light seemed to shine into his gloomy world. He couldn't help but fall in love with Gavin. Gavin's background is indeed as Elias told me. Broken but strong. That the takeout she delivered by mistake 2 years ago was by no means accidental. At that time, Elias happened to be an employee of Holden's rival. When he accidentally learned that Holden had been drugged by the rival, he told Gavin. Gavin's brother owed millions in the casino at that time. This was far from what she, a waiter, could pay off. So she set her sights on Holden. Facing the tearful plea of the girl he loved, Elias finally helped her. Not only did he give her money but also sent her to escape abroad and give birth to the child. In addition, I also got a piece of news. The amount of drug given by the rival at that time was not enough to make Holden turn into a beast immediately. It was just half reluctant. I looked at the information in my hand with a sneer. When the veil of fairy tales is torn off from the story of Cinderella and the prince, people find out. Cinderella is a scheming woman who is eager to marry into a wealthy family. The prince is also a jerk who can't control his lower body. When I was still in the hospital, Holden announced Philip's existence at a family banquet. Philip was recognized by his ancestors and returned to his clan under the witness of everyone in the circle. And his mother, Gavin, was also exposed by the circle. I and our family became the laughingstock of the entire capital. When Mom heard this news and saw me lying weakly on the hospital bed, she was so angry that her hair turned white overnight. The company also began to have internal and external troubles because of Philip's appearance. Dad, who was working hard to take charge of the overall situation day and night, began to feel unwell in his heart. And the child in my stomach stopped developing without warning on the day, when the plot reached the point where I deliberately had an abortion to frame Gavin. I listened to the doctor's diagnosis result numbly. There was a buzzing in my ears. Mom tightly held my shoulder and couldn't help crying. And I seemed to have closed all my 5 senses. The surrounding sounds seemed to be unable to enter my mind. I could only see the doctor's mouth opening and closing. Everything seemed to be following the plot. Even if I did nothing, the child was still gone. I would still be sent to a mental hospital. My parents would still be ruined. Nothing would change. At night, I curled up on the bed trembling. Those feelings of pain, unwillingness, the sour anger of being deceived by Holden, and the trampling of my pride and self-esteem now are like black waves that want to devour the heavens and the earth. They refuse to subside and won't stop. If there must be villains in the plot, if someone must sacrifice for the love of the protagonist group, why must it be me? I secretly arranged for someone to contact Gavin's parents and brother and vaguely told them that Gavin now has become important because of her child, and is attached to the famous Fu family in the capital. Gavin's parents and brother immediately came to the capital. According to my instructions, They found the house that Holden bought for Gavin and refused to leave. Gavin was so angry that she was at a loss but had no other way. At the same time, I contacted Holden's rival who drugged him back then and asked him to give Holden a file on Elias and Gavin. Gavin's innocent persona was shattered. And the most important thing for a self-righteous man is his own face. Now it's good. Everyone in the capital circle knows that Holden, a person who has always been smart, has been calculated by a woman. Doubts about Holden began to appear on the internet. Such a brainless and pretentious boss. Will he really not bankrupt the company? Shareholders who don't trust him began to sell their stocks. The board of directors and Holden's father had great opinions on him. And more people began to sympathize with me as the original wife. I heard that Holden had a big fight with Gavin and then told her to get out of the house he bought. But Holden also knew that there must be something strange about all this. So he found me. He came to see me in the hospital. His eyebrows and eyes were a little tired and decadent. I didn't follow the doctor's advice and stop the pregnancy. So when he came, I touched my stomach and looked at him with a smile. Do you know? There was once your child here. I think my expression must be extremely crazy now. Otherwise, how could Holden, who has always been calm, have his pupils tremble and show an incredulous expression? There will be children in the future. Zhao Zhen. Let's live well in the future. I promise that Gavin won't appear in our lives. Give me a chance to make up for you. Of course. He hopes that I can live well with him now. It would be best if I could help him issue a statement to save his social image and status. But how can there be so many things in the world that go according to his wishes? I calmly took out the divorce agreement and silently handed it to him. Holden tore up the divorce agreement with red eyes and hugged me, gnashing his teeth and saying word by word, "If you want a divorce, only if I die." I smiled faintly and replied, "Okay." At the charity dinner, Holden attended alone without a female companion, and I made my first appearance after leaving the hospital. The male companion by my side was Bryson, the son of the John family who hasn't been seen for a long time. This is undoubtedly slapping Holden in public. Everyone looked at the three of us and whispered and discussed. Holden coldly looked at me holding Bryson's wrist. The anger in his eyes almost dyed his pitch-black eyes red. Bryson provocatively smiled at Holden. Holden stared at the two of us firmly throughout the banquet. It wasn't until I came out of the toilet that he blocked me. "Are you really with him, Savior? At the time when I love you the most and need you the most. How can you change your heart?" Holden grabbed my wrist and questioned me bluntly. I coldly shook off his hand. In the next second, Holden was punched in the eye by Bryson, who walked over. Holden let out a muffled groan and fell to the ground, covering his face. Bryson shook his hand. After wiping the blood-stained watch clean, he put it back on. He looked at Holden lying on the ground with indifferent eyebrows and eyes. I took a step forward and said to Holden, "Who I'm with has nothing to do with you. Don't be cheap. Holden, I don't wear Gavin's black rim glasses. I don't have a domineering filter for you. I really find you disgusting now. Don't come to me again." After saying that, I didn't look back at him again. It was as if he was some roadside garbage. I walked away in disgust. Holden stood silently, staring blankly at the backs of me and Bryson leaving hand in hand. I think at this moment, he really realized that I don't love him anymore. I refused to accept all the reconciliation text messages and calls from Holden. Even the mutual friends who spoke for him were blacklisted by me. I have other things to be busy with. Gavin's brother Armando now owes 20 million in the casino under my name. He wrote an IOU and tearfully begged Gavin to help him again. Gavin was extremely annoyed because of her relationship with Holden. Moreover, she was kicked out. How could she have money for Armando? Gavin disgustedly shook off Armando's hand that was pulling her and said viciously, "Money. Money. How many holes have I filled for you since I was a child? Otherwise, sell your sister me and see how much I'm worth." At this time, the eyes of the parents on the side moved. Thinking of Philip at the Fu residence, they said, "Philip is their Fu family's own grandson. Can he always get some of the property?" Armando's elder brother was like a drowning person grabbing a life-saving straw. A greedy smile bloomed at the corner of his mouth. But Armando couldn't block Holden. And the Fu family also refused the Shen family to see Philip. At this time, Armando's kind gambling friend gave him an idea. If Holden died, Philip could inherit the inheritance. The repayment date of the casino was imminent. Armando squatted in the parking lot and looked at Holden's car with a sinister look. Holden died. The reason was that the brakes failed. He fell off the cliff with the car and died without a whole body. Gavin cried heartbreakably holding Philip at his funeral. But I touched my stomach and faintly curled up the corner of my mouth. On the day Holden died, the fetal heart rate of my baby started beating again. And because of Holden's death, the plot in my mind was all changed. From a dog-blood president novel to a big female-led revenge novel. I became the real protagonist. The villains are Holden and Gavin. So there is nothing unchangeable or predestined. I am my own fate. I am my own sky. Armando was arrested by the police. And Philip didn't get most of Holden's inheritance as the Shen family expected. Because I am the first heir. Gavin, who lost an elder brother and didn't get the expected inheritance, insanely kidnapped me. I sat calmly on a wooden chair. Behind me was the cement pool of the construction building. As long as Gavin gave a light push, I would die without a burial place with my child. Gavin's eyes were full of a triumphant smile. Savior, is there anything else you want to say before you die? I looked at her indiferently and said, I want to say that you are really stupid. After planning for so many years, it's still all in vain. The smile at the corner of Gavin's mouth froze. Her eyebrows and eyes were fierce and gloomy. But now, as long as I push you down, my Philip will get all of the Fu family, and you will be built into the wall by the construction workers who go to work tomorrow. Look at me and Philip living a happy life forever and ever. The smile on Gavin's mouth grew bigger and bigger. Looking crazy. I didn't change my expression and motioned her to look behind. At some point, many figures of armed policemen appeared behind. Bryson's eyes were flushed at the end. Standing at the front, he looked at me firmly. He discussed with Gavin to exchange himself for me. But he didn't know how much Gavin hated me now. How could she agree to the exchange? I nodded and smiled slightly at him, motioning for him to be at ease. Gavin sneered. She also knew that in this situation, even if she didn't kill me, she couldn't escape legal sanctions. The cold wind was rising. Gavin's face was pale, holding the wooden chair. She was still loudly arguing. She instigated my brother to kill Holden. I want to kill her. What's wrong with me? I want to clear all obstacles for my child. I want to live a better life. What's wrong with me? Gavin looked at everyone and murmured obstinately. I'm not wrong. I'm not wrong. Philip is still waiting for me at home. Then there was a flash of firmness in her eyes when she looked at me. Just as she was about to push me down, a gunshot hit her right between the eyebrows. The crowd that surged up surrounded me. I coldly looked at Gavin's dead eyes. In the next second, a palm blocked my eyes and hugged me into his arms. Bryson faintly had a crying tone and hugged me tightly. Do you know how scared I was just now? I almost thought I was going to lose you again. I always had a GPS on me. So when I was missing, my family and Bryson received the signal I sent at the first time. This was indeed a risk. But if I didn't take the risk myself, I would never be able to truly get rid of Gavin. After Gavin died, her accomplice Elias was also arrested and put in prison. My car accident was not an accident. It was intentional by Elias and Gavin. At Bryson's law firm, the best lawyer in charge of such cases will help me fight the lawsuit to the end. I suddenly thought of that genius baby Philip. If he grew up. Bryson held my hand. His tone was unhurried and soothed the restlessness in my heart. He said, I'll handle the rest. Don't worry. I'm here for everything. I looked into his bright and gentle eyes. Full of my figure. I asked by a strange impulse. Why are you so good to me? Can't you see that I like you? Sister Yeezy. I have liked you for many years. Suddenly there was a soreness in my nose. Honestly, I don't know why I want to cry. So I held it back hard. And reason is reminding me that my life doesn't need another man anymore. I deliberately replied coldly. I am a vicious female supporting role. You will be unfortunate if you get close to me. Just look at the fate of Holden and Gavin. Bryson seemed to think seriously for a moment. If not being loved makes one a vicious supporting role, then I guess I am also a vicious male supporting role. I pursed my lips and then said, I don't plan to get married. Bryson nodded inferently. You know, I don't care about this. The child in my stomach is Holden's. And I don't plan to have another child. I looked at Bryson. Probably no man can accept raising someone else's child for a lifetime. Bryson's mouth curved into a smile. His warm palm carefully touched my stomach. Looking at me firmly, he said, when we played house when we were young, you always played the mom and I always played the dad. Sister Xiao Yi. For this time's playing house. Are you willing to give me another chance? I didn't answer his question and turned to look out the window. The yellowed maple leaves gently fell on the ground. The bright sun in the sky burned the leaves red again. The cunning autumn always appears inadvertently. The Bryson in front of me seems to be a little more cunning than autumn. I thought secretly.